since that 20-second performance. Well, I'm glad to see that there are actually people here, not just recorded clapping. Rachel asked me to talk about a few topics, part of the general picture, important part of it. One is the criminalization industry. Second one related to it is the assault on the African-American population, colored population generally in the past generation, and a related matter of the racial strategies that have been devised and implemented to carry all this through. The obvious place to start is in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement and its iconic figure, Martin Luther King. When you listen to the oratory on Martin Luther King Day, I'm sure you've noticed it typically ends in 1963 with his I Have a Dream speech in Washington. But that's not where it ended for King. In fact, for him, that was just the bare beginning. He intended to go on and did go on, and immediately ran into a brick wall because he was beginning to deal with class issues and with issues in the North. So it's okay to condemn racist Alabama sheriffs, but not what happens around here, and not issues of class, which is what he turned to. As you know, I'm sure he was assassinated 5 years later when he was in Memphis supporting a strike of public service workers, sanitation workers, and on his way to lead a march which would bring about a poor people's movement, a march to Washington. Well, he did. He was killed. He gave another I Have a Dream speech the evening he was killed. He used his usual biblical rhetoric, said that he felt he was like Moses standing on a mountain. He could see the promised land. He knew he would never get there, but if you struggle on, you can get there. A world designed of peace and justice, nothing, solidarity among people, understanding. Poor way he was killed. Even word men are about what's going on and why. So when you integrate through the fire department, places in the South, police departments, major civil rights struggles, others, ended up in Washington. The marchers treated it as Tent City, Resurrection City. Then there's people who are suffering. They're stayed there briefly. Security forces are taking our money. They're smashing it up in the middle of the night. They're taking our job. We're letting us symbolic of and what happens when you go on class issues, human rights issues. And if you looked at the where we live up here, the maps, instead of the red and blue states. My comment, let me read his words at that time. The only thing he said is the name. It's necessary for us to realize that we've moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights, providing jobs, better housing, better education for the poor throughout the country. Privileged white America must recognize that justice for black people cannot be achieved without radical changes in the structure of our society. The comfortable, the entrenched, privileged cannot continue to tax at the prospect of change in the status quo. We have moved to a new era, which must be an era of revolution. However, we see a great distinction between the reform movement and the revolutionary movement. We're called upon to raise certain questions about the basic structure of the whole society. Late 60s, still work asking those questions. What happened afterwards was complicated. Activism did continue to many victories carefully designed. So it 70 after sense continued. There was also an immediate backlash. very strong. Police discretion, backlash to make arrests. These included dedicated efforts where you go to the rich white dismantle the use of drugs was higher in the rich white deal. The major drug also to undertake a war against mainly the black population, colored communities, and to deal with the suffering of the poor white population, who were also victims of this, by exploiting what's sometimes called racial pride, exploiting the fears of the working people and working class whites in the very classic ways, it goes all through history, to try to break down the solidarity and the mutual support that are what are desperately needed to address the real problems of the whole society. A major part of it in the mid-70s was simply to redesign the economy. And the word design is critical. It wasn't just something that happened. These are planned changes in the nature of the economy, alternatives available all the time. That two major factors of it were the shift from production to manipulation of finance, huge increase in financialization. You could make more money that way by playing games with complicated financial instruments than by producing things. The production did continue, but it was offshore. You can use miserable, horrendous working conditions in Mexico, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh to replace working people in the United States. One effect of this, there are many effects of this. One that's very visible is what happened to the minimum wage. It's a critical way of maintaining at least a floor under the living standards of poor people, working people. Through the post-New Deal period, the period of great growth in the economy and pretty egalitarian growth, the minimum wage kept up with productivity of labor. Now, that's totally changed. If that had continued past the 70s, the minimum wage now would be about $25, almost $25. That's what it is. That's one sign of the assault against the general population, the sometimes called the neoliberal assault, what Vijay was talking about all over the world here too. That hit primarily working people and poor people, disproportionately black because of the race-class correlation, also working-class whites. And they had to, their concerns had to be dealt with too. That's where the racial strategies come in. To deal with this problem, one device that was constructed was to eliminate the superfluous population, and not by murdering them, because we're a civilized country, so putting them into prisons. That began around 1980. Really 1982 was when you could begin it. Or if you go back to that period, around 1980, the criminal population in the United States was, relative to population, was about the same as other industrial societies, a little on the high end. But now, as I'm sure you all know, it's out of sight, 10 times as high as comparable societies, in fact, higher than any society in the world, proportionally to population, at least any society that has any data or statistics. So what happened? Well, what happened is that in 1982, Ronald Reagan instituted, he actually revitalized the drug war. Drug war goes way back. Nixon had revived it, but Nixon, who was the last liberal president, really, he revived it, and that's not a joke. In fact, Congress is now trying to dismantle Nixon's liberal achievements. He did revive the drug war, but in a pretty fairly humane way, certainly by contemporary standards. there was a component, a significant component, that dealt with prevention and treatment, the only things that worked. That changed in 1982. That component disappeared, and it was done in a strictly racist fashion, overtly racist. Those of you who are old enough to remember will recall Reagan's favorite anecdotes about welfare queens, rich black women who are driven in their limousines to one after another welfare office because they have a lot of Social Security cards, and they take your hard-earned money. Well, that meant something to poor white working people who were also being smashed in the face. They're taking our money. Busing and other strategies were designed so as to set poor people at each other's throats. So if you take Boston, for example, which was typical, the suburbs, mostly white, fairly affluent, were not involved in busing. It was between South Boston Irish communities and black Roxbury, Dorchester communities. So that led to the feeling, understandable, they're not only they're taking away our money, they're taking away our communities. The integration programs were designed so that there would be nothing, there would be no understanding among the poor white people who were indeed being harmed about what's going on and why. So when you integrate fire departments and police departments, but of course not seriously the faculty at Harvard or the executive suites, maybe 2 or 3 black faces allowed in there, then there's people who are suffering. So they're taking our money, they're taking our money, they're taking our communities, they're taking our jobs, we're left with nothing. And you can see it. Just take a look at the last election. You see it very striking.
Right.
If you looked at the electoral results, the maps the day after the election, the red and blue states, it's the Civil War. The only thing that's changed is the names. The red parts that used to be Democrat are now Republican. That's Nixon's Southern strategy. Change the names, keep the racism. A majority of poor white working people voted to cut their throats, their own throats. They voted Republican. There were polls, for example, of Southern whites, just Southern whites, asking them what their attitudes were about taxes. Like everyone else in the country, overwhelmingly they were in favor of raising taxes on the rich, which are ridiculously low. However, that same majority was in favor of Romney's tax plan. And it possibly is ignorance, or it possibly is just racism. Since he's on our side, going after them, we're going to favor his plan. Well, a lot of this stuff worked. It was played very effectively. Why 1982? Well, that's, as I said, when the drug war was started. And it was very specifically designed, carefully designed, so it would go after the African American population. That begins with police discretion. So where do you go to make arrests? Do you go to downtown slums, or do you go to the rich white suburbs? Actually, use of drugs is higher in the rich white suburbs. The major drug use is affluent professionals and white students, much higher than blacks. But the point isn't to go after drugs. The point is to fight a race war that goes on through prosecutorial discretion. Prosecutors have enormous latitude. They can decide what to do through the sentencing programs, which you can get huge sentences for having a tiny bit of crack in your possession, or for that matter, for having somebody you don't even know about putting something in your house. Tremendous sentence. On the other hand, for driving under the influence, alcohol, you get a couple of days. Alcohol, driving under the influence of alcohol is far more lethal than drugs. Kills way more people. And of course, all of it pales totally as compared with the major drug killer, tobacco. Tobacco is a monstrous killer. There's just an academic study that came out called the Tobacco Holocaust, which estimates that about 100 million people were killed by tobacco in the last century, and they estimate about a billion in the next century because it's expanding. It's a very profitable industry. It isn't criminalized, but strikingly, use of tobacco has been significantly modified. It's now pretty much a class issue. So if you go to a elite university, the students aren't smoking, but the staff are. And if you go to the nearby McDonald's, kids hanging around there without jobs, they're smoking. It became a class issue because of cultural changes in education, just the kind of things that in fact are known to work. And if you happen to read the New York Times a couple of days ago, you might have noticed an interesting story. There finally have been class action suits which compelled the tobacco companies to pay a kind of, from their point of view, pennies to compensate for the extraordinary massacre that they've carried out. It is kind of a holocaust. But the states are not using the money for prevention and treatment, even though their own data shows not only that it's effective, but that it saves them money. It saves them a lot of money. It saves them, it's highly cost effective. The amount spent for prevention and treatment sharply reduces hospitalization costs, other costs, but it doesn't matter. That's not the kind of thing we do. The sentencing, the discretionary programs and the ridiculous sentences have created a black population which is stigmatized for life. You never get out of it. If you're an ex-felon, and a felon might mean some minor drug charge. If you're black, not if you're white, you're a felon forever. You can't get jobs. You can't get housing. That's thanks to Bill Clinton. One of his achievements was the one strike you're out policy. If you have any conviction, you're out of public housing. Even if you're suspected of it, you look like somebody who would be a criminal. So, no jobs, no food, can't get food stamps, can't vote. No relation to crime. He's supposed to drag me off stage by the neck.
I have a grappling hook.
One minute. Let me just say a word about the prison and the industrialization of crime part, which is quite interesting. But those of you who know any African-American history know that all of this is a reproduction of things that have happened before. For 250 years, there was literal slavery. Slavery was formally ended in the 1860s. It lasted for about 10 years. And then a new process was developed of criminalization of black life. So if a black man is standing on a street corner to be accused of vagrancy, gets a $20 fine, which he can't pay, has to go into debt, and he's in jail forever. He ends up in the prisons. The prisons became a fantastic labor force, much better than a slave labor force. Slave owners used to criticize northern industrialists, claiming that they were more moral because they owned their labor force, so they had to take care of them. Like if you own a car, you take care of it. The northern industrialists just rented their labor force. If they didn't like them, they'd throw them out. Well, once you have the state maintaining the labor force, you don't have to, it's for the industrialists, it's free. We're familiar with the chain gangs, that's the agricultural part. But a large part of the American Industrial Revolution in the 19th century was based on this. mining, steel plants, and so on. Huge labor force, criminalized labor force. But that went on almost to the Second World War, when it was necessary to have free labor, to work in the war plants, serve in the army and so on. Then came about 20 years of substantial economic growth. A black man could get a job in an auto plant that was unionized in those days. You'd get pretty decent wages and buy a small house and send your kid to college, that kind of thing. Now that ended in the 70s for the reasons I mentioned. We go right back to criminalization. Now that's exactly what's done. There are now estimated about 1 million laborers in the prison system. They're working for a pittance, of course, but a perfect labor force. Textiles, furnishing, all kinds of things. Well, there's a way out of this, namely solidarity. In the 1930s, what happened was with the rise of the labor movement, there was black, white, working class solidarity. People working together for something, broke down the racial barriers. That had happened in the 1890s, in fact, in the labor movement, also in the populist movement. But it was beaten back by violence and by racial strategies. We're now there again, but without the solidarity that has to be reconstructed. So to go back to Martin Luther King, if we're going to raise questions about the basic questions about the whole society and move from an era of reform to one of revolution, it's going to be necessary to address problems like these and to overcome the propaganda, to educate people about it, and recreate the kind of solidarity and mutual support that's essential for making any progress in the face of these kinds of permanent assaults.
Noam Chomsky.
Good evening, everyone. It is a real honor to be here this evening, especially since this is the first time I've had the opportunity to personally meet Noam Chomsky. I can't believe it, because I've been reading his books and listening to him on the radio and on CDs for I don't know how long. He actually is exactly the same as and 2 months ago, we both participated in the Russell Tribunal on Palestine. But he was under the weather and Skyped in. That's why I said this is the first time I've actually had the opportunity to meet him in person. And this time, it's my turn to have a really bad cold. And I almost stayed at home and Skyped in. But I woke up at 2:30 this morning, and I thought about Noam Chomsky, I thought about Vijay, Prashad, and Mel King, who I've known for 40 years. And all the amazing people from Critical Resistance and the 2 other organizations that are co-sponsoring this benefit, the City School and Black and Pink. So at 2:30 this morning, I could hear my deceased mother's voice telling me that she knew I could do it. Bag and headed for the airport, hoping that I would feel a little better. And so here I am, trying to offer you some ideas about radical futures and prospects for freedom. The term future, of course, is always relative. It's relational. A future is a future always in relation to a past and a present. We are living a present today that in many ways was unimaginable as the future 20 years ago, or 30 or 40 years. And of course, when Obama was elected the first time, so many people said that they had never expected to witness the election of a black president in their lifetimes. And then later, I suppose, many thought that it was unimaginable for a black man to act like a president of the United States. But after all, that is what he is. But some of us can say that we never expected that racist violence, and indeed racism more broadly, would persist in such blatant and insidious ways well into the 21st century. Once the mid-20th century freedom movement took hold, many of us expected that it was only a matter of time before we began to root out racism. When most of us try to imagine a future for ourselves, for our communities, for our worlds, we think about futures without violence, am I right?
Yes.
Without the violence of war, without the violence of occupation, without police violence, without school violence, without racist violence, without Islamophobic violence, without ableist violence, without homophobic violence, without sexist violence, without prison violence, which can only mean without prisons. And of course, without interpersonal violence, no more violence. Some 45 years ago, I remember being involved in a number of campaigns against racist police violence. And I believed then that progress would come in a much more obvious way. I believed that there was no way that the same kind of racist violence would persist 20, 30, 40 years later. And all of us, of course, remember the killing of Trayvon Martin earlier this year. And I noticed reading the New York Times yesterday that George Zimmerman is once again in the news in relation to his suit against NBC for editing his 911 remarks and for making him appear to be a racist predator. But what I would say is that what has not changed is the assumption we often make, or we make too often, that individuals bear the brunt of responsibility for that racist violence. And think back maybe 7 or 8 months ago, when there was a flurry of activity around Trayvon Martin. His name was in the news every day. There were demonstrations and all kinds of events. And then what happened? George Zimmerman was arrested. You remember? And then all of the activity stopped. It all stopped. It came to a halt as if the arrest of a single perpetrator could reverse the centuries of racist violence inflicted on Black people, Latino people, people of color. And let me say that this is actually one very strong argument for prison abolition. Putting one person in prison cannot reverse a whole history of racist violence. Putting people in prison cannot address the issues that imprisonment attempts to address. But let me say that this is a strong argument for seeking ways other than imprisonment to dismantle the structures of violence in general. Now, when we think about violence, we tend to think about male bodies as the targets of violence, right? Of violence in war, violence in prison, violence on the street. However, the most consistent targets of violence in the world are women. And let me say this again. The most consistent targets of violence in our villages, our towns, and our cities, wherever we might find ourselves in the world, are women. And so this leads us to ponder the connections between intimate violence, family violence, rape, battering, femicide on the one hand, and police violence, vigilante violence on the other. This leads us to ask questions about the relationship between racist violence, gender violence, intimate violence, state violence. To discover the complicated ways in which these modes of violence are organically linked is, I think, the work of imagining radical futures. We cannot imagine radical futures if we do not grasp these connections. There have been vast movements against violence against women all over the world for the last 40 years. Studies have proliferated, programs have developed and expanded. Law enforcement people have received more trainings than you can possibly imagine. There are programs within prisons, yet that violence continues unabated. The violence continues. More perpetrators of gender violence are in prison all over the world now than ever before. But the incidence of violence against women has not gone down. And it is not surprising that communities that have historically suffered numerous forms of violence, from slavery to war to police violence to over-incarceration to over-punishment within the educational system, it is not surprising that girls and women in these communities suffer a disproportionate burden of intimate violence. As horrendous as it may be, should we really be surprised that family violence and intimate sexual assault continue to keep pace with the proliferation of institutional and structural violence in the world? Violence against women and girls not only bolsters gender-based hierarchies, but class hierarchies and racial hierarchies as well. In a culture that continues to pathologize women of color and criminalize men of color, is it at all surprising that violence pervades intimate relationships? Violence is used to address social problems so that the majority of the almost 2.5 million people behind bars in the US today are people of color. Black students are much more likely to be punished in schools than white students, from kindergarten through high school. But why is it so difficult to think about violence against women and girls without thinking about law enforcement and carceral strategies as the solution. Of course, there is a relationship, but we tend to assume that that relationship should involve the incarceration of perpetrators. And this may be because we have no sense of the future. It may be because we have no historical sense, because we want instant solutions. We want instant solutions to the problem, and perhaps also instant solutions to the problem of thinking about the problem. So if we look at law enforcement and incarceration as shortcuts that allow us to shift our focus from something that is very painful to reflect on, to an expression of anger, of revenge, of retribution, that is what the prison allows us to do. That is what the strategy of imprisonment encourages us to do. And so what I'm trying to say is that the logic of criminalization and incarceration is a logic of diversion and deflection. We have acquired the habit of shifting our focus to punishment rather than dwelling there at a very difficult place in order to eventually, hopefully, discover ways of eliminating violence, not simply punishing it with more violence and therefore reproducing this violence in myriad ways. And so this logic of diversion and deflection, do I really only have 45 seconds left? Okay. I just looked at my timer and now it says 33 seconds. I'm getting very anxious. Well, one of the points that I was going to make is that whenever we address the question of institutional violence, we also have to look at the family, which is a site of the social reproduction of an exploitative system. The family often recapitulates the violence of a larger society. The heteropatriarchal family is inconceivable without its role as a haven for violence against women and girls. What you might call heteropatriarchal violence is also replicated in some same-sex relationships. So this is one of the reasons why being in favor of gay marriage is not so simple. We also have to ask the question, how do we challenge the structure of violence, the structure of marriage, the violence against women and children that is inherent in the family? And I'll have to just summarize some of the things that I was going to say. I was going to talk about violence against women, violence against trans women, violence against lesbians. And I can say that I just came back from, this is probably why I'm sick in the first place. I've been traveling too much, been in too many planes. But I just came back from the World Social Forum, Free Palestine. Free Palestine. That was held in Porto Alegre, Brazil. And let me say that our work on prison abolition has to extend to the abolition of open-air prisons as well. Palestine, of course, is the largest open-air prison in the world. So what I'm suggesting is that as we imagine radical futures, we have to commit ourselves to work on theoretical and practical terrain that is broad and expansive rather than narrow and restrictive. I know we tend to use the term intersectionality, and I think we've grown too comfortable with that term. And I wonder whether we shouldn't continue to search for formulations that come closer to what we mean when we say we don't want to focus on single issue approaches, but rather approaches that require us to think deeply about links and connections and relations among issues and among struggles. And one of the problems with the notion of intersexuality is that we often think of it as a point of crossing, as a point where axes cross each other. And even though that point of crossing need not be conceived, I see Vijay is getting ready to walk over to pull me back. But I just wanted to say in relation to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, that the critique of pinkwashing has become really important in the sense that it not only reveals the shallowness and the contemptuous character of the democracy that Israel purports to represent, but it broadens the terrain of struggle against the occupation and against the Zionist policies of Israel. And everybody knows what pinkwashing is, right? In two words, the representation of Israel as gay-friendly and as supporting women's rights. And so what we have to do is learn how to read the racism and violence that is covered up by this putative pro-gay and pro-feminist stance. Live in the future we might not have been able to imagine a generation or two ago. What are the futures we strive toward today? Let us not be afraid to imagine the most radical possible futures. Even when it is said this goes against human nature, without prisons, for example, we would be unable to deal with the dangerous people of the world. The process of imagining radical futures with prospects for freedom requires us to stretch our minds and our vocabularies and to recognize that even if prison abolition or the eradication of violence cannot be achieved in our lifetimes, let us stretch our imagination much further than our lifetimes, further than the lifetimes of our children or grandchildren or even great-grandchildren. When I think of committed activists like Frederick Douglass or Ida B. Wells, they never would have been able to imagine our present. But without the movements with which they were associated, we would have no foundation on which to build radical futures today. Thank you.